Because we do not know when we will die, we get to think of life as an inexhaustible well. And yet everything happens only a certain number of times, and a very small number, really. How many more times will you remember a certain afternoon of your childhood? An afternoon that is so deeply a part of your being that you can't even conceive of your life without it. Perhaps 4 or 5 times more, perhaps not even that. How many more times will you watch the full moon rise? Perhaps 20, and yet it all seems limitless.
Happy heresies, my beloved truth seekers. Make yourselves at your true home at Coffee, Cigarettes, and Gnosis, the first ever radio show dealing with the Gnostics, Gnosticism, and Gnosis, and their brethren in the Esoterica. We avoid scholarly pontification and definitely shy away from New Age babble. We don't take prisoners here at the virtual Alexandria, but liberate them instead. Blasphemy should never be this much fun, and it was Meister Eckhart who wrote that blasphemy is the best way to know God.
Another day, another defilement.
So light up your smokes, pipes, or punctured coke cans, because where there's smoke on the water, there's always fire in the sky. And make sure you've got some fuel in your cup, because coffee is for closers, and the Gnostics are the original cafe beatnik society of all ages and dreams.
It was a very special time and place to be a part of. But no explanation, no mix of words or music or memories can touch that sense of knowing that you were there and alive, in that corner of time in the world, whatever it meant. There was madness in any direction, at any hour. You could strike sparks anywhere.
Yes, on this approximately Saturday, January 12, 2008, we are still the Gnostics, the veterans of 1,000 psychic wars. Once we were alive, but now we are just surviving. Once we were one with the divine imagination, until error, plan in Greek, crept into providence of the Aeons and luminaries, and turned us into the sparkling tears of Sophia that fell far into the catacombs of creation.
Impure! Impure!
Now we're trapped in a reality we did not make, drunk, asleep, and gripped by the nightmares of a mundane world of sunshine and farts. Like a Gnostic sage once said, thank God for reality and the means to escape it. Or as Matchbox 20 sang, I wish the real world would just stop hassling me. But hassling it will, for the creator of this universe wishes the essence of our creative spirits like a cosmic golem over a golden ring of power.
That God does not like you, he never wanted you. In all probability, he hates you.
You may know him as the Demiurge, Jehovah, the Architect, or the Cosmocrator. Philip K. Dick called him Zebra or the Artifact. Nietzsche described him as a ferocious dragon we must slay with thou shalt written on each of his scales. To Jesus and the Cathars he was known as Satan. Buddha knew him as Mara, Schopenhauer as the Universal Will, William Blake as Nobo Daddy, and Herman Melvin as Moby Dick. You may just know him as your ego.
You are a smelly pirate hooker.
The names change, but the reality is that reality won't leave us alone to access our own inner Albion, Avalon, Atlantis, or Xanadu. It's as simple as that, my beloved true seekers. And the Demiurge especially dislikes the nomadic Gnostics, the secret Christians of the true invisible church. He has hit us with everything and the bathroom bidet for thousands of years. Valentinians, Manichaeans, Bogomils, Cathars, Kabbalists, and all the incarnations of the Gnostics have been hunted down like drunken sorority girls admitting they had drank too many buttery nipples.
Before this battle is over, the world will know that few stood against many.
But of course things have changed, right? This is a civilized era of religious tolerance and animal rights and non-smoking bars. This is the age of iPhones and global warming sensitivity. The Gnostic should be as safe as the locked chest of Twinkies from your average Wiccan chick, right? Wrong. It's happening again. It will continue to happen. And what I'm talking about is the Mandaeans, if not the original Gnostics, the last remaining Gnostics of ancient times. For over 2,000 years they have survived pagan, Christian, and Muslim empires, far more fortunate than the other Gnostikoi. But this time Samuel and his angelic mafia have decided to take them out before the message of pacifism and divine knowledge spreads out of the Middle East. The Second Gulf War has opened the pathway for the demons of intolerance to strike, and now this minority of all esoteric minorities is on the brink of extinction.
We keep heaven packed with fresh souls.
So who exactly are the Mandaeans, and why are they in so much trouble? And what can we do as members of the compassionate Esoterica? Our guest today will light a beacon over a grim path of a Gnostic sect that few know about. This is Nathaniel Deutsch, author of The Gnostic Imagination, Gnosticism, Mandaeanism, and Merkabah Mysticism, as well as professor of religious studies at Swarthmore College. Beyond a scholar of Mandaeanism, mystical Judaism, and early Christianity, Nathaniel is an activist involved in finding a way to save the Mandaeans from the fangs of orthodoxy that has taken the form of Islamic fundamentalists working for Allah, another avatar of the demiurge.
See, gentlemen, greed is for amateurs. Disorder, chaos, anarchy. Now that's fun!
It's an informant and yet tragic interview, my beloved true seekers. Check it out. As for what I have to say, the solar logos called Abraxas, is that the Mandaeans are more than likely a breakaway group from Judaism in pre-Christian days, much like the Scythians, Essenes, Ophites, Samaritans, and Therapeutae, just to name a few. And like the Scythians and Ophites, they chose the road of Gnosis to understand and escape this concentration camp called the cosmos. And unlike many of the libertine Gnostics, these Semites buckled up with rigid rituals and edicts, a fierce xenophobia, and categorical mythology that allowed them to live in basically the same spot for century after century after century. And this from a people who believe that carrying a weapon is a sin.
Do you ever get tired of watching bad things happen to people? That's crazy talk.
Mythologically, or perhaps even factually true, the Mandaeans might be one of the splinter groups of the John the Baptist sect. After all, before Jesus came along and recruited folks for this war against the Archons, there was already a chosen successor in the name of Simon Magus, father of Gnosticism and all other heresies. With his sidekick wizards, Dositheus and Menander, these baptizers and their followers thrive across the Levant and challenge Christianity a few countless times. They were known as Simonians, Barbalites, Hellenians, and other names. Perhaps the Mandaeans were part of these squadrons of mystic Jews and direct descendants of the spiritual lineage of Simon Magus and John the Baptist. And even beyond, Johannite Christians have existed throughout time, the Knight Templars being the most famous. There is certainly evidence they interacted with the Mandaeans in the Near East once upon a conspiracy theory.
The issue isn't whether you're paranoid, Lenny. The issue is whether you're paranoid enough.
You also might call the Mandaeans a sort of bizarro Gnostics, for they turn traditional theology even more on its head than their brethren in the western parts of the Roman Empire. To them, Jesus is an evil charlatan that usurped the secrets of his cousin, John the Baptist. They do dig his mother, the Virgin Mary and God-bearer, but really don't like her son. Like most Gnostics, they do think Moses was one of the main pawns of the demiurge, or Yaldabaoth.
We will not live by your commandments, we're free!
There is no freedom without the law!
Maybe even more shocking is that the Mandaeans see Sophia, the Holy Spirit, as a nasty bitch who wants nothing good to happen to mankind. Their name for the demiurge is Ptah, which sounds similar to the Egyptian god Ptah, the architect of the universe in their cosmogony. But before you let all of this settle into your own dogmatic opinion, you must remember that the Mandaeans really have no uniform scripture and enjoy reinterpreting their myths and theology as much as other Gnostics. Anything can be altered or changed to suit the changing culture or the psyche of the community. Furthermore, astral travel and altered states of consciousness fish different versions of the cosmic drama.
Then the pain came back, and the voices. They call me by name. Jesus.
You're sure it's God? You're sure it's not the devil?
I'm not sure.
The Gnostics were doing midrash long before it was popular with the Jews. To a Gnostic, a contradiction simply means a different side trail to enlightenment, and one more way to confuse the rational mind in order to get to that aha moment. Nothing is set in stone, the dead place the church was built upon, but theology is fluid and living like the waters of the heavenly Jordan the Mandaeans believe in. And at the end of the day, it is Gnosis that the Mandaeans and we want, crave, and fight for. Gnosis is our best chance in understanding the mind of God and the divine mind that wants to awaken in our hearts. Gnosis is freedom. Ignorance is the original sin.
Free your mind.
But now a great source of Gnosis is about to be extinguished. The John the Baptist Christians, as Portuguese missionaries called them centuries ago, are being murdered, forcibly converted to Islam, kidnapped, raped, and all sort of indignation by zealots let loose because of the chaos of the Iraqi invasion. Scholarship was just beginning to understand the Mandaeans and their wonders in the last few generations, and now that might be lost. I beg you, my beloved truth seekers, to exercise a little activism and let it know that this antique heretics must be protected.
People should not be afraid of their governments. Governments should be afraid of their people.
The best way to start is going to Mandaeanunion.org. That is Mandaeanunion.org, spelled Mandaeanunion.org. Mandaeanunion.org. There you will find resources, links to petitions, and information on supporting a congressional resolution that will give them preferred immigration status. Their numbers are dwindling, and if the Mandaeans go the way of the Cathars or the classic Gnostics, then Zebra has succeeded in darkening yet another lamp of liberation from human history. We can't let it happen.
There is always hope. Only because it's the one thing that no one has figured out how to kill yet.
And remember, when you do acts of kindness, don't do it because it makes you feel good, or even because it's the right thing to do. Do it simply because you and the Mandaeans are one. You are extensions of one another. There is no separation. There is no distinction in the field of real living. When we love our neighbor, we love God, and vice versa. Compassion comes from the Latin to suffer with. We suffer together. We help each other suffer less throughout lifetimes and dimensions, so that one day we may experience that one moment of supernova satori that will free all of us for good. And before the interview with Nathaniel Deutsch, who will dispel any questions you might have about the Mandaeans, let me read to you a small Mandaean liturgy that reveals the depth of their mysticism. Although world-denying and dualistic are dirty words in the neo-Gnostic movement that attempts to force modern New Age sensibility upon the old myths, I think you'll see that's not the case with the original and last of the Gnostics. From the day when I came to love the life, from the day when my heart came to love the truth, I no longer have trust in anything in the world. In father and mother I have no trust in the world. In brothers and sisters I have no trust in the world. In what is made and created, I have no trust in the world. In the whole world and its works, I have no trust in the world. After my soul alone I go searching about, which to me is worth generations and worlds. I went and found my soul. What are all the worlds to me? I went and found the truth, as she stands at the outer rim of the worlds. From the day when we beheld thee, from the day when we heard thy word, our hearts were filled with peace. We believed in thee, good one. We beheld thy light and shall not forget thee. All our days we shall not forget thee. Not 1 hour let thee from our hearts. For our heart shall not grow blind. Thee soul shall not be held back. This is the Coffee, Cigarettes, and Gnosis interview. Today we'll be talking about the Mandaeans, their history, and their present plight in the Middle East. With us today is Nathaniel Deutsch. How are you doing today, Nathaniel?
Good, how are you? Thanks for having me on.
Although it seems it's a much-discussed topic, and I've read several theories in so many books, what would you say are the earliest origins of the Mandaeans?
It's actually a very complicated question because no one knows exactly where they come from. The Mandaeans have their own origin story, which is that they would date their origin to Adam, the first man, who is both a kind of prototype and, in a kind of genealogical sense, the first Mandaean. There are other stories within Mandaean literature that link their origin to the land of Israel, to the area around Jerusalem, and link it in that case to tensions that arose with the Jewish community there and a kind of splintering off that occurred, and then the Mandaeans moved east towards Mesopotamia. There are another possibility is that they grew out of indigenous Mesopotamian community. So there's a kind of Mandaean mythological explanation tracing back to Adam. There's the idea that they come from the land of Israel or Palestine. There's the idea that they are descendants of indigenous Mesopotamian people. There are a few other theories. So the earliest texts, I think, that are extant date back to around 200 CE. And one of the ways you can date Mandaean texts is that they have what are called colophons. They have scribal notes in the books and scrolls that they compose. And so as a scribe recomposes or copies a scroll in his possession, he'll write down information. And based on those kind of genealogies there, you can date, it's one way of dating some of the scrolls. And I think the earliest one is 200 something, if I'm not mistaken. So we know at the very least that they go back that far, and there's been a debate for pretty much as long as there's been Mandaean studies in the West as to whether the Mandaeans are pre-Christian or post-Christian, and what their relationship is to Christianity and to certain Christian texts, like the Gospel of John, for example. It's unclear. I mean, I don't think anyone knows exactly when and where the Mandaeans first emerged as a distinct community. There were a lot of baptizing groups in the first few centuries of the Common Era. Most of them are extinct. A couple of them, Christians, Mandaeans, are still around.
And it seems a lot of people have said that maybe they were part of the John the Baptist sect. You know, in Acts of the Apostle, Paul meets a group of them, and I think the Pseudo-Clementines talks about, the Simon Magus and others being the splinter group that didn't go with Jesus. What do you think of this? Is this just speculation?
It's speculation. I mean, it's worthwhile thinking about those kinds of things. I tend, in my own work, I've tended to focus more on the possible connections between Mandaeism and Judaism than the Christian angle, although there are other scholars who focus on that aspect of it. It's clear that there were a lot of different groups. Ultimately, Manichaeism is going to be another one, right? Some of them are in Palestine, some of them are in Mesopotamia, around Syria, Egypt. It's a very fertile time for these groups, and in many ways are sharing a lot of the same traditions. The Hebrew Bible, both what are ultimately going to be canonical and extra-canonical Christian writings, Plato, and other Greek writings, Neoplatonic writings, and they're also kind of drawing on the common pool of magical traditions, on ritual traditions, and so to identify particular communities, particularly at their kind of originary moments, is not always so easy. It's easier when you have a kind of founding figure, for example, in the case of Manichaeism. But other than that, it becomes more complicated. So I think it's worthwhile to explore all of those things, particularly when you have textual connections. Like, for example, people have explored the connection between some of the Mandaean texts and early Manichaean texts. And most recent scholarship would say that Mandaeism was one of the influences, one of the kind of cultural influences in the milieu that Mani grew up in and kind of developed his own theology in.
And why would you say the Mandaeans are considered to be Gnostic?
Part of that designation has to do with their name, and there's a debate as to the etymology of their name. One of the etymologies relates it to a Semitic root for knowledge, and so their name would mean knowers in the same way that Gnostic in Greek means the one who knows. So that would be that's one reason why people identify them as Gnostics. Now there's another explanation for that name, another common one, which is that it has to do with the Mandi, which is a kind of fenced off area in a river or other body of flowing water that is used for ritual purposes, or the Manda hut, which is a hut that's used again for ritual purposes. And so they would be the people who use this hut or this fenced off area. So that would not support, let's say, at least in terms of the etymology of the name, a connection to Gnosticism. More than that, though, there are texts. Mandaeism, one of the reasons why it's so significant and so fascinating is that although it's been a small community probably for its entire history relative to say Islam or Christianity, for example, it has a very rich body of literature that has been built, that has kind of been produced over the centuries. So it's not like there was one period 1800 years ago when people produced texts and that was it, but they've been continuing to produce them. And in those texts we find a number of significant parallels to Gnosticism, to what's called Western Gnosticism or Western Gnosis.
For example, aren't the Mandaeans perhaps more dualistic than the classic Gnostics? That seems to be the one striking thing. It appears that makes them closer to Manichaeans in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, there's a kind of a tendency among scholars of Gnosticism or dualistic religions like Manichaeism, Gnosticism, Catharism, Bogomilism, the various traditions that have been described as dualistic, to distinguish between kind of radical dualism and a more moderate dualism. And the Manichaeans are kind of the poster children for the radical dualism insofar as they posit a kind of originary and almost existential or even existential kind of distinction and break and opposition between good and bad, light and darkness, and there's just kind of ongoing conflict between those two from the very beginning. Whereas the more moderate dualism that often people would attribute to, let's say, Western Gnosticism, would be the idea that you start out with a good principle, usually described as the Father or the One, or there are various names for it. In Mandaeism, it's life, and then through usually a series of emanations, you ultimately move away from that until finally there is some kind of rupture in the Western Gnostic tradition. It's often associated with Sophia, the figure Sophia, and then her abortion, quote unquote, Yaldabaoth, who's the demiurge, and then you have the creation of the bad. But first you start with the good, and then you move away from it, which is probably more influenced by a kind of Neoplatonic notion of kind of the good being degraded as you move further away from the source. Mandaeism is interesting because Mandaeism has some, as I mentioned before, there's an enormous number of texts, and they reflect different periods in Mandaean history. Some of the texts are more Manichaean in terms of the way they describe the opposition between the world of light and the world of darkness, and some of them are more, let's say, moderately dualistic in that they describe a more kind of emanatory, or in the case of Mandaeism, they'll often talk about how different aspects of life are created through a call, for example, or emanation, or even some kind of creative process. So depending on the text, I know that's a long answer to your question.
Oh no, don't worry. This is wonderful.
Yeah, depending on the text, and this is something you cannot give a definitive answer when it comes to Mandaean. I hesitate to even use the word theology, because to me theology implies a marriage between Greek philosophy and the Hebrew Bible, which is definitely not philosophical. So what happens when you merge Greek philosophy, and typically Platonic philosophy of some sort, with biblical stories, is to me, Christianity really invented theology, because that was that combination. And so you have an attempt to apply certain philosophical principles to texts like the biblical story of creation, or the biblical, I should say, stories of creation, which already poses a problem from a philosophical point of view, that really don't lend themselves that easily to philosophy in terms of things like no contradictions, logic, all those things. So you end up with this, these efforts to, in fact, systematize thought about things like Jesus's, like Christology, Jesus's nature. If you look at the New Testament, a lot of stories that, in some senses, the versions might contradict one another, or at least give different versions. And then you see the early church fathers, who are in many cases influenced by philosophy, trying to derive a certain almost philosophical portrait of Jesus's being. Is he God? Is he man? Is he always man or always God? Is he both? Is he sometimes man, sometimes God? All of that. In Mandaeism, although arguably there are some places where you could detect the influence of philosophy, perhaps through the influence of some Western Gnostic traditions that may have entered Mandaeism, in general it tends to be even more kind of mythological and earthy than the Western Gnostic texts, some of which are extremely philosophical, as I'm sure you know. The Mandaean texts tend to be less so, although, again, you can sometimes see a kind of, some influence of philosophy. So, in my opinion, when you tend to have the greater the influence of philosophy, the more likely it is that you will have a kind of a move towards a more definitive account of something. In the case of Mandaeism, you don't have that effort to systematize, to choose one version over the other. In that sense, it's more akin to kind of Jewish midrash, where you have multiple versions of different events, stories that are allowed to coexist, even if you were to point out to someone, even though you could point out to someone, well, wait a second, this story contradicts that story. That hasn't seemed to be a problem for either Jews or Mandaeans in the sense of, sometimes people will try to choose, but those within the literary traditions, you can have all of these multiple versions. So in the case of Mandaeism, to get back to your original question, you have some texts that evince a more radically dualistic view, some that evince another one that's more moderate, different stories about where the world came from, for example, in some cases that are more radically dualistic than others. It's very hard to pin it down in that respect. Manichaeism, for example, in my view anyway, it tends to be much more uniform, and although it's quite complex too, but one of the reasons why Manichaeism became a worldwide religion is because it could be so easily translated into different idioms, and a lot of the basic ideas would remain the same. You could just plug in different figures that were local, whether it's Buddha or Jesus, whoever, and use a lot of the same concepts and the same mythology and translate it into Uyghur or translate it into, whatever other languages, Latin, whatever. And the basic ideas would remain the same, and Manichaeans in different places could understand one another and share share a common body of traditions. Mandaeism, kind of what's extraordinary about it is that here you have this very small community that's living in really one place. They're producing all sorts of this enormous variety of views that, if you were to take it all together, it would show the spectrum of dualistic traditions, all produced by this one community over time.
And Nathaniel, but don't the Mandaeans, unlike classic Gnostics, or I guess any of the people of the book, quote unquote, don't they turn things upside down by actually making Jesus the villain of the cosmic play?
That's an excellent point, because when you describe the Mandaeans as Gnostic, or when one says, the Mandaeans are Gnostics, the issue of Jesus should then be addressed, because as you know, a lot of the quote Western Gnostics, in fact, see Christ. Christ, and I use that in a kind of Christological sense of a high Christology. Christ as a divine being rather than as a human being. He is one of the more popular savior figures. In some of the quote unquote Christian Gnostic texts, he is the savior figure who's sent in order to provide people with knowledge of the true self so that they can escape this world. Now, of course, there are differences between the way Gnostics would see Christ versus the way or see Christ in terms of, did he really have a physical body? Did he suffer? All that stuff. But nevertheless, a lot of it is quite Christocentric. even the Gnostic texts that don't focus on Jesus or Christ as the Savior, as far as I know, there aren't any in the Western Gnostic tradition that attack him as a false prophet, for example. Now that isn't the case for Mandaeism. In Mandaeism, actually, there is a polemic against Jesus as in fact just that, a false prophet or a false Messiah, a deceptive Messiah, deceptive prophet. So it suggests a number of things. One is that they are very well aware of Christianity, and there's actually extended polemic against Christianity, against Judaism, against Islam. So they're aware of all these traditions, and they're interacting with them to some extent. And they're aware of, for example, in the Christian case, there are some polemics against what appear to be maybe the Syrian monastic tradition. In cases like that, you might be able to, in fact, situate where a text might have come from or from what period it might have come from. I'm not sure if it helps really to answer whether Mandaeism preceded Christianity or not, which was certainly one of the more important questions for the early scholars of Mandaeism. But it does point to a pretty complex relationship between Mandaeism and Christianity.
And also, Nathaniel, with Judaism, because they also see Moses as somebody who was, don't they see Moses as somebody who was given the law by the demiurge? They're not too keen on Moses either.
No. In general, Judaism, I mean, my view is that Mandaeism probably emerged out of a Jewish context at some point, and that over the centuries in Mesopotamia, they had very close relations, which were probably much more amicable than the texts would suggest. The text of not only the Mandaean text, but if you look at texts produced by pretty much every religious tradition, certainly in the Middle East, a lot of them will, if you look hard enough, you'll find negative things said about other people. Okay, but on the ground, what you see, particularly, for example, when you look at the so-called magical tradition, the magic bowl, one example that would be magic bowls, which we have a number of examples of that have survived that archaeologists have discovered, where it becomes clear from the language that's used, from the different divine beings or angelic beings that are invoked, the names of the scribes, the names of the customers, which are sometimes inscribed on it, that there was a lot of cross-cultural contact going on between these different peoples, even if officially in their elite texts they were antagonistic. They were neighbors. In the case of the Jews, the Babylonian, the dialects of Aramaic used by the script is different, but the dialects, the spoken dialect of Aramaic was very similar. The Mandaic and the dialect of the Babylonian Talmud, for example, is quite similar. And in some cases, they were living in towns or areas that were overlapping one another. So, it may be one of those cases of the anxiety of influence, or where your neighbors, you generally get along with your neighbors, but when you fight, you kind of have more. It can take on a different connotation when you fight a neighbor versus a complete stranger. One of the things that I've studied is the possible relationship between Mandaeism and Jewish mysticism, and the fact that some of the Kabbalistic traditions that emerge, or at least are written down, I should say, in Spain and in Provence and southern France in the medieval period, may in fact be rooted in earlier Babylonian Jewish traditions that have a lot of parallels to some of the things you find in Mandaean texts. So while on the one hand, you see a big effort on the Mandaean part to distinguish themselves from Jews and to criticize Jews in a variety of ways, claiming that they don't follow purity laws properly, and describing them with a word that means something like abortion and all sorts of negative things. On the other hand, they have stories that suggest that way back in time, they lived together with Jews and kind of maybe split off, or maybe some of them were Jews. I mean, it's a little hazy. And then, as I mentioned before, historically, there was probably a lot of contact between Mandaeans and Jews, and my guess is that a lot of that did not reflect the hostility that you see in the texts themselves. So that's another thing that's important to keep in mind is, you have the texts, but then you have the way people actually live on the ground. And one of the things that's significant about Mandaeism in terms of the broader context of Gnosticism is that we actually know very little about the way Gnostic communities that produced the text, let's say the Nag Hammadi text, how they lived. Now people have tried to extrapolate, like Elaine Pagels, for example, in the Gnostic Gospels, made certain, tried to make certain, I guess you could say, sociological arguments about what kind of people or what kind of communities these were, attitude towards women, things like that, attitude towards authority, and how they differed in turn from Orthodox Christians. And to some extent you can do that, but in no other case do you have a community like the Mandaeans that have existed from late antiquity and that are still around, and you can still ask these questions about, they are, how do they live now, for example. Let me give you another example in terms of Christians. There have been different periods in Mandaean history where people have either thought that they were Christians or where the Mandaeans may have, sort of allowed them to think that they were some sort of Christian just to make it easier on them.
Right.
You see what I'm saying? And one of the reasons that that's happened is not only because of John the Baptist, whom the Mandaeans revere as a teacher, a great teacher, also because, there are a number of rituals like baptism, for example, like a staff. There's a staff that Mandaean priests traditionally would have, and that kind of resembles Christian staff. I mean, so there are other parallels that make that kind of association possible, even though, it should be said, Mandaeans are not Christians, which even, I think, in the New York Times a few weeks ago, or maybe a month ago, an article just en passant mentioned the Mandaeans, and I think it referred to them as like a form of Christianity, which is just not accurate. I mean,
right, indeed.
Yeah.
And Nathaniel, what are some of the more notable rituals they have? You mentioned baptism. Don't the Mandaeans baptize each other every day?
Well, there's Matzbuta, yeah, there's baptism, and in Arabic they're actually known as the baptizers, Subis. Their baptism is typically on Sunday. A priest called a Tarmida typically perform the baptism in flowing water, living water, it's called, and it's also, which is in Mandaic you call it a Yardna. It's basically the Mandaic form of Jordan, as in the Jordan River. And there's a Jordan River, a celestial Jordan River, and then flowing waters on earth are kind of earthly incarnations of that heavenly Jordan. And so you have to do it in this living water, and the priest does it. People do ablutions themselves. There are different rituals that they perform with water themselves. Mandaeism is very concerned with purity in terms of eating, in terms of menstrual purity. And in this way, actually, there's a number of parallels with Judaism and Shia Islam in particular. And so baptism is an important ritual. There are rituals for what's the right word? It's not inaugurate, but to make someone a priest. There are different feasts, sacrifices. There's wedding ritual is important. Funeral ritual is very important. I was speaking to a Mandaean on the phone, a friend of mine last week, and he was saying that one of the most difficult challenges for Mandaeans in the diaspora, I guess you could say outside of southern Iraq, Iran, is where you bury people. He was describing a community where they purchased a plot of land to make a Mandaean cemetery, and they were forced to do that because someone died suddenly. And they had been talking about doing it, but when this person died, they realized they had to do it right away, and they got permits, and someone donated land, and they were able to do that. But the funeral is particularly important because of, again, and here's where the kind of Gnostic element comes in again, because your soul is seen as leaving this world and returning to use the Western Gnostic term, your pleromatic home. and you have to make it through different obstacles, and you have to be, you need to rituals will help you to do that, and then you're going to be weighed by this figure called Abator, and then you'll cross over water and you'll make it into the world of light. And so you want to make sure that everything is done in a ritually correct way. When a child is born, there's a baptism. Soon after, people go have weekly baptisms. There are various festivals. When you make it a priest, funerals, weddings. These are all events that are marked with various rituals. And access to flowing water is very, very important to Mandaeans. And the priests are English term, are very important to Mandaeism as a lived tradition. And actually, one of the things that's happened as a result of the war is that the priests, many of them, maybe most of them, have gone into exile as well. In Syria, this friend of mine was telling me, the priests have the most difficult time because, the other Mandaeans can often blend in with the Iraqi refugees in terms of the way they're dressed, but the priests are very distinctive in their clothing, white clothes, turban, a few other things that would identify to them, and long beards. And so he was just saying, when they go to the market, for example, to go shopping, people know, they're like, what are you? They may not know they're Mandaean, but they know they're something else. Many of the other Mandaeans, traditionally Mandaean professions in Iraq were goldsmiths, metal workers. They made boats, metalworking. More recently, a lot of them have gone into, some of them continue to do that, be jewelers of some sort, but more recently, a lot of the younger people have become professionals, have gone into professions. So in that sense, often tend to be, quite worldly and assimilated and in many ways, but the priests are very distinctive in their appearance, and so that has been
caused some problems. Yeah. And Nathaniel, before we move on to their modern plight and everything, do the Mandaeans actually believe in Gnosis?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that makes, one of the things I would say that makes it, if it's not a branch of Gnosticism, then certainly related to it is this, for example, there are stories about Adam and how Adam is, and here you see some real parallels with both Western Gnostic tradition and some Jewish, some rabbinic midrash traditions about Adam being this kind of big kind of blob, basically like a golem that needs to have spirit to become animated. And so they take some spirit, in the Mandaean case, they take some spirit, rucha, and they animate Adam, and then Adam is enlightened by a figure that's sent from the Paroma. And so Adam, the kind of creation of Adam and enlightenment, if you want to use that term, of Adam, is a prototype for what Mandaeans are supposed to experience as well. And as in the Western Gnostic case, Adam has this ruch, this spirit, and also this knowledge, and yet is stuck in this world, which is dominated by these, malevolent at worst and kind of ignorant and foolish at best creatures. Powers is a better term. So yes, I mean, that's what makes Adam the first Mandaean, and he serves as a prototype for other Mandaeans. Now there is a split between the kind of laity, if you want to use that term. I wouldn't say it's as extreme as in the Manichaean case, but there's more there's more fluidity between the categories, between the lay Mandaeans or the Mandaeans that say don't know as much about their tradition, and then Mandaeans who are much more in the know. So even within the Mandaean community, you would have people who are identified as being much more knowledgeable. Not all of them. I mean, the priests are expected to be that way, but there are non-priests that possess more knowledge of Mandaeism too. And so there is some division within the community, although all Mandaeans, because, and here's where the rituals come in too. It's not just a matter of possessing knowledge. And sometimes when you read the Western Gnostic text, you might get that impression. It's just, and maybe for some of those communities, it was more focused on that. Unfortunately, we just don't know the role of ritual. You know, for example, when it talks about the bridal chamber, well, you know, in a Gnostic text, well, was that a ritual, or was there a ritual that accompanied that?
Right.
And what did it involve? And was that the source of some of the heresiological critique? You know, where they'll accuse the Gnostics of eating semen, or instead of, you know, the Eucharist, or whatever it is. You know, was there in fact a ritual that they are transforming in the heresiological writings, on the one hand, and then describing in more kind of spiritualized terms in the Nag Hammadi text? But at the core, maybe there is in fact a ritual that some Gnostic community or group was engaging in, that then kind of has these, is then reflected in these different literary ways. In the Mandaean case, you know, in a sense, the rituals are the more consistent and systematized, and the texts are the more kind of complicated, varied, even in times contradictory, in the sense of, you know, different versions that don't necessarily jive with one another.
Well, it seems that the Mandaeans, much like the Jews in the diaspora, were able to survive all these centuries through the, you know, the Christian and the Muslim empires. What happened that their situation became so dire? What was the turning point in recent time?
Well, I mean, if you look at each of the minority communities in the Middle East, there have been different periods when things have been better or worse. So you could go through Mandaeism just as you could go through Jews in like Iran, or, you know, in the 19th century in Iran, there was persecution against Jews. And then, but ultimately there have been periods where it's better. So in the case of Mandaeans, it's the same way, that, you know, some periods were better, some were worse. Some of it depends on whether a local leader or religious leader identified them as being one of the protected people according to the Quran. And there's been a debate within Islamic jurisprudence over whether the Mandaeans should be identified with a group called the Sabaeans, which are one of the, along with Christians and Jews, one of the three groups identified as a protected people of the book in the Quran. And the Mandaeans would like to have that identification, because then they would be tolerated as a religious minority, acceptable religious minority. And some Muslim jurists have in fact accepted that, and others haven't. So some of the toleration or lack of toleration has depended on that. Under Saddam, the Mandaeans were, and religious minorities like Yazidis or Chaldeans or Assyrians, or, you know, there's an enormous variety of, you know, religious minorities there, were more or less tolerated, but could, you know, were still in different ways discriminated against. But in general, were tolerated, and had been there for, you know, in all those cases I mentioned, Chaldeans, Assyrians, Yazidis, whatever, have been there, Mandaeans have been there for many, many centuries, and were really woven into the local fabric. So, and under Saddam, that continued. So, for example, in a town in southern Iraq, you might have a street called, you know, the Subi Street, where all the Mandaeans had their metalsmith workshops, and they were, you know, they knew their Shia neighbors, and you know, people might have stereotypes of one another, or maybe sometimes there might be some tension, but people would generally speaking get along. What happened with the invasion is that fabric, the local connections between peoples, the neighborhoods, all of those have been, you know, in many places anyway, just torn apart. And neighborhoods that were integrated at one point, at one time, are now segregated. People who leave, they can't come back. Either they don't want to come back, or their homes have been taken over, or their homes don't exist anymore. You know, for a group like the Mandaeans, it's particularly difficult because, you know, they are in many ways the most vulnerable of the vulnerable. They don't have a really kind of safe haven, as some of the other groups in the north in particular have. And their religious rituals are, as I said, performed by priests who are very distinctive looking, and they're done out in the open in flowing water. And that has been the source of harassment and in some cases violence when they've tried to perform some of their rituals. It's one thing if you've lived with your neighbors and you've known and your grandfather knew their grandfather, etc. There's a certain tolerance that's built on that. But when you become a refugee and you're suddenly in a new place and no one knows you from Adam, and you're different, and maybe you're from the south and now you're in the north, or you're in Baghdad, it becomes very you become even more vulnerable, particularly at a time when a lot of people there are engaging in different forms of ethnic cleansing based on people's backgrounds, religious and otherwise. And just to toss one more thing in the mix, which really has nothing to do with religion, but because the Mandaeans have historically been involved in metal work, which actually may have something to do with religion in the sense that in the Middle East, a lot of minority groups end up, whether it's Jews in a place like Ethiopia or North Africa, end up getting involved in metalwork because that profession is seen as polluting. So a lot of times the dominant group doesn't want to engage in it. So you end up with a minority group engaging in it. But because they've been involved in that profession, they're seen as having a lot of money. And therefore they've also been targeted by people because they think they can get their gold, things like that. Tremendously. They don't have a larger community elsewhere, to count on. It's not like there's a couple million Mandaeans in England or America that can help this wave of refugees. They're all they have. There are probably fewer than 100,000 of them in the entire world.
Wow.
It's amazing that they've survived for this long, and that's one of the most tragic things about all of this is that here they've survived various invasions and reversals, and now for this to be the thing that puts them in certain ways probably a greater crisis than they've ever experienced. So they're really trying to figure out ways of making sure that this isn't the beginning of the end, but rather the beginning of another chapter in their history.
And is anything being done actively by any of the governments, like the United States or England, to help them out?
No, the short answer is no. I mean,
oh dear.
Yeah, unfortunately, the United States has taken in very, very, very few refugees. I think last year was 7,000. Maybe that was even what they pledged, and they ended up taking fewer than that. But that's a drop in the bucket compared to the number of refugees. I mean, the 5 million externally and internally displaced Iraqi refugees. They really have done. There was some recent legislation, American legislation, that opened the possibility for a group like the Mandaeans to be led into this country to be given what's called priority 2 status, which is preferred, which is a kind of privileged refugee status, where the process is expedited and larger numbers of Mandaeans. Only really a few have been allowed in thus far, but if they were granted that, larger numbers of Mandaeans from Iraq could come into this country. Now, I think that Iranian Mandaeans, it's a smaller Mandaean community in Iran, that they actually already have P2 privileged priority 2 refugee status because of the American government's relationship or lack of relationship with Iran, and the American government has taken a stance on religious minorities on providing on expediting refugee status for religious minorities from Iran, but not from Iraq. So ironically, actually, I think in recent years, more Mandaean refugees from Iran have come into this country than from Iraq. So the United States has not done very much thus far, although there is this legislative opening that was created a few months ago, and hopefully that's something can be built on. Sweden, of all the Western countries, has probably taken in more Iraqi refugees than any other country, although I think now they might be trying to restrict the number. Australia has a fairly large Mandaean community. By that I mean like a few thousand people. Right now there are there are a couple of groups, some Mandaean groups. There's a group called Mandaean Crisis International, which is primarily non-Mandaeans, a lot of scholars and other people who are interested in helping the Mandaeans, who have been trying to work to help the Mandaeans. I'm been working with a Mandaean named Dr. Wissam Brigi, who's recently been trying to establish a group that will specifically focus on helping Mandaean refugees. And his goal, I don't want to speak for him, but he and I have had conversations and talked about trying to bring in kind of critical mass of Mandaean refugees into the United States, settling them somewhere. I mean, that's actually one of the things that's good about the United States, is that historically it has been a place where religious minorities and groups that were communities that were persecuted elsewhere have been able to find a home here and to thrive here. It is possible for the Mandaeans to come to America or Canada or Australia and create enough of a community that they can perpetuate themselves. Part of the issue is that you cannot convert to Mandaeism, and in order to be Mandaean, you have to have both of your parents have to be Mandaean. So there really is a need to have enough Mandaeans in a particular area so that people can find marriage partners, so that the religious life can be, and the cultural life can be replicated and passed down. If there are just small pockets all around the world, it's going to be very, very difficult to do that.
And what can we do as private citizens to help the Mandaeans? What are some of our options?
Well, I know Mandaean Crisis International has a petition that has been circulating. I think, as any time that there's a crisis like this, whether it's in Darfur or Bosnia or here, the more voices that are heard and the more contacts you make with your congresspeople is always helpful. To encourage congresspeople to include the Mandaeans in any legislation, and to specify, to be very specific, that the Mandaeans have there are particular reasons why the Mandaeans should be singled out as requiring expedited refugee status. And there are a lot of Iraqis that should be getting refugee status, and they're suffering tremendously. But there's probably no other group that as a community, could become extinct as an indirect result of the war in Iraq. So I think those are a couple of things. I think I wish I could go beyond like letters to the editor or writing to your congresspeople. This Mandaean Crisis International, going online, looking for Mandaean activists and Mandaean groups that there are a number of websites, sending an email asking Mandaean activists, what you can do. That's really what I've done. I mean, I don't presume to speak for the Mandaean community at all. I mean, I really want to try to help. I want to try to help the Mandaeans who have taken the lead, to try to help them do what they think is right. I know that a number of Quaker individuals and some people who are quite involved in different Quaker groups have expressed an interest in helping to relocate Mandaeans. And there are models for this, refugees from Somalia, refugees from Sudan. We have, whether they're religious minorities or just, people who have been, suffered during war. America has a long history of bringing in, and recent histories, Hmong from Southeast Asia, settling people. So if you belong to a not-for-profit or a human rights organization or a church or another religious organization that has had a history of doing that, bringing up the plight of Mandaeans and seeing whether your group, whatever it happens to be, would be interested in trying to help them, reaching out to them, and then contacting one of the Mandaean organizations that's listed on the web would be very helpful. If you're interested in, you're also welcome to contact me. My email information is, you can find my email through Swarthmore College, where I'm a professor, and I can make sure that it's passed on to Mandaeans who are working on this, because I really think it's a matter of helping Mandaeans to figure out what is right for them. I mean, in an ideal world, Mandaeans have lived in Iraq and Iran for 2,000 years. What's now Iraq and Iran for 2,000 years, if not more. It would be great if they could recreate their communities there. The Mandaeans I've spoken to just don't think that that's a realistic option for the foreseeable future, and feel like a better option is to try to create vibrant communities in what's now the Mandaean diaspora.
Well, Nathaniel, I think that's all the time we have today. I'd like to thank you for coming on the show, and hopefully we can reach as many listeners as possible and
well, I want to
get
thank
some
you,
education.
because I know that you're, as far as I understand, you're the only radio show that focuses on Gnostic issues. Am I correct in that?
Yes, pretty much.
And I think that the fact that you're not just interested in as interesting as in the Nag Hammadi texts are, and Manichaean texts and all this stuff, which hey, I'm the first guy to say it. This stuff is amazing and fascinating.
Yeah.
It's also wonderful that you've devoted a show to flesh and blood people who have been carrying on these traditions for thousands of years and who are really in dire need of knowledge. People knowing about them. Talking about Gnosis. I mean, this is kind of if Gnosis is the beginning of the journey, then this kind of knowledge for people to at least, and through things like your radio show, to know about the Mandaeans, because a lot of people just don't know. It would be willing to help if they did know. So I really want to thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. It's my pleasure, and I wish I could do some more, but I'll try and do some more while I can.
This is a great first step, so thank you very, very much.
Thank you, and again, thanks for coming on, and good luck with everything.
Okay, thank you. You too.
Kara? Don't freak out, it really is me. It's gonna be okay.